Good evening, everyone. My name is Mary Oken, and I am the Assistant Director of Living New Deal. I'm delighted to be here with you this evening. If you're new to our organization's webinars and events, we are a private donor-supported nonprofit that nurtures understanding of the New Deal's impact on society and culture. Since 2009, we have been documenting, mapping, and educating people about New Deal art and public works, creating the largest online archive of geolocated New Deal sites, including New Deal projects near you if you live in the United States. If you haven't done so already, please check out our New Deal map. I'll post a link in the chat after the webinar. At Living New Deal, I've been supporting our organization's growth, including heading up and advocating for New Deal art initiative. As the first art historian on staff, this has been a particularly fun part of my job, as over the last year and a half, I've had the opportunity to connect with New Deal art scholars, curators, collectors, allied professionals, and enthusiasts, and begun to help strengthen connections among them. Tonight's webinar highlights 3 members of the initiative who have worked on the History of the Public Works of Art project, PWAP for short, which was the first program to provide unemployment relief to artists under the New Deal. And you'll be hearing lots more about it from our speakers. Tonight's webinar aims to do several things. First, 2024 marks the 90th anniversary of the PWAP, which was a 5-month project that began in December of 1933 and ended in the spring of 1934. So it's an opportunity for us to celebrate its 90th anniversary. Second, our speakers will introduce you to the inner workings of the program and some of the artists. And then third, I've asked our speakers to share both their research and tips for researching. So I hope this webinar will be useful to all those interested in PWAP history and also how to discover it. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to thank our many donors, and especially the donors to the Advocating for New Deal Art initiative, who support both our community building efforts and our virtual and in-person events. Your support helps to, provide for programming such as this, and this webinar kicks off what will be a series of webinars about New Deal art, some more happening this fall and certainly into next year. To stay apprised of those webinars and other exciting things Living New Deal is doing, please consider signing up for our newsletter and also following us on social media. So without further ado, our wonderful speakers for this evening. Ann Prentice Wagner is director of the Bradbury Art Museum at Arkansas State University. Previously, she curated at the Arkansas Museum of Fine Arts and the National Portrait Gallery. In 2009, Dr. Wagner worked with George Gurney at the Smithsonian American Art Museum on the exhibition 1934, A New Deal for Artists, and the exhibition catalog of the same title, which included extensive research on the Public Works of Art program. Dr. Wagner earned her doctorate at the University of Maryland. Jennifer Peoples is Associate Professor of African American Art and a faculty affiliate of the Institute of African American Research at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. He co-curated the 2024 exhibition Sargent Claude Johnson at the Huntington Library Art Museum and Botanical Gardens, the museum's first major exhibition focused on the work of a Black artist. He also co-edited and contributed to the accompanying catalog, including a chapter on Johnson's public artworks for San Francisco's Aquatic Park Bathhouse. Bowles is the author of New Negro on the Pacific Rim, Sargent Johnson's Afro-Asian Sculptures, a chapter in A Long and Tumultuous Relationship, East-West Interchanges in American Art, published by the Smithsonian Institution Press. He is currently writing a book about Johnson that argues for the artist's importance as both a West Coast modernist and one of the most innovative artists of the New Negro Renaissance of the 1920s and 30s. In 2022, Bowles curated the exhibition Modern Black Culture, The Art of Aaron Douglas for UNC's Ackland Art Museum, which also is connected to the New Deal. Jennifer Peoples Hernandez, our final speaker, is the author of Belle, Baranceanu, Life, Art, and the New Deal Renaissance by Lexington Books, published last year, the first biography on the artist and a history of work relief and federal government art projects in San Diego. Dr. Hernandez is also the curator of San Diego's New Deal Renaissance, an artist's experience on view at the San Diego History Center until September of 2024. She also curated Belle Baranceanu, the La Jolla murals for the La Jolla Historical Society in 2017. Her work has also been featured in the American Art Review. In addition to writing and curating, she teaches as an adjunct professor of history at San Diego Mesa College. Thank you all so much, and I will pass it over to Ann.
Thank you very much, Mary. Let's just get my screen shared. Is that good for everybody? Start from the beginning. Okay, yes. Thank you so much for the introduction, Mary, and thank you very much to the Living New Deal for putting together this program. It's exciting to get back to the Public Works of Art project after quite a few years. The PWAP was a revolutionary government program that came at a critical moment in the Great Depression. It was the first and one of the briefest of the federal government's New Deal national art projects, in place only from December 1933 until May 1934, with some administration going on longer than that. The PWAP was the experimental model that proved the federal government could effectively support artists financially and bring art to the public on a national scale. The PWAP worked out central ideas and broad organizational outlines, as well as a lot of personal connections that led directly to the later, longer, and often better known New Deal art projects, including the Treasury Relief Art Project, the Treasury section of Painting and Sculpture, and the Works Progress Administration's Federal Art Project. And all of those were done by 1943. Okay. Wait a minute. I'm not getting my slides advancing. There we go. And here is one of the lovely venues that the 1934 show went to. Once Franklin D. Roosevelt had been inaugurated in March 1933, his administration worked as rapidly as they could to design and implement broad federal relief programs to improve the foundering American economy. They were desperate to do something for the unemployed and underemployed American workers when millions had no dependable source of income, food, housing, or heat. Artists were not widely seen as a major part of the American economy, but several people stepped up to urge Roosevelt to include artists in the New Deal. In May 1933, artist George Biddle, who had been to a couple of the same schools as Roosevelt had, wrote a now famous letter to the president advocating the federal support of artists and the use of art in federal buildings to communicate the ideals of the New Deal. The idea caught FDR's attention, and Biddle was one of those consulted as the administration considered the question of relief for artists. But the idea was also supported by Francis Perkins, the Secretary of Labor, Federal Relief Administrator Harry Hopkins, Alfred Barr, the director of the Museum of Modern Art, and numerous artists and art organizations contacted the administration. Lawrence Robert, the custodian of federal buildings, brought the new Treasury Department employee and artist Edward Bruce into the discussion. And you can see Bruce on the left here. He was enthusiastic about the idea. He held a series of meetings in his DC home, a rented home, but it was large enough to have big meetings in during the autumn of 1933. He gathered major government players to convince them to embrace federal arts programs. He argued that artists were workers like any others with family support, and government-backed art could help to inspire dispirited Americans and to promote American art. Relief Administrator Harry Hopkins agreed to allocate over $1 million to relief for artists from the Civil Works Administration, the agency that had been created to administer the $400 million Public Works Administration. With funding in place, the PWAP could go forward. The program would pay artists a regular wage to execute art to be used to ornament public buildings such as schools, museums, post offices, courthouses, a lot of places. Artists were separated into higher and lower levels of what was seen as important. Sometimes there was argument about that, and paid accordingly. $35 to $45 per week for Class A artists, $20 to $30 per week for Class B artists, and $15 per week for laborers. And later, when they had to cut the budget, not only were a lot of people taken off the rolls, but also the pay was reduced. Because the Civil Works Administration funding was slated to last only until February 15th, 1934, the PWAP funding would also run out at that time unless they were granted further funds. So they had to get to work rapidly, and they had to impress government officials in order to have any hope of continuing programs that would last long enough to do much good. On December 8th, 1933, Bruce held an organizational planning meeting in his home, and he invited prominent museum directors from across the country and other major arts figures and special guest Eleanor Roosevelt. You can see some of those folks in this slide. The Civil Works Administration had already divided the country into 16 regions to administer its programs, and Bruce used the same 16 regions to structure the PWAP. So he would put together organizations of volunteers, or he would begin them, and the leaders of each one would follow up. And each region was divided into state committees. They varied tremendously in size and scope, depending upon how many artists you were dealing with in the different regions. At the December 8th meeting, they chose the regional heads of 8 of the 16 regions, calling upon all 8 museum directors who were present at the meeting. Museum directors were seen as those who would best know the local artists and be able to choose among them most fairly without the conflicts of interest that could hamper artists or art dealers or some other people in the field. Of course, no, there are potential problems with almost anybody you would choose. So they were the ones that they did choose. So they initially went with people in New England, New York, Pennsylvania, the DC area, the New Orleans area, the St. Louis area, Western Pennsylvania, and the Cleveland area. The other 8 regions were a little more difficult to organize. They were in areas where there were fewer museums in many cases, and where Bruce had fewer contacts. So it took a little longer to choose those. And in those regions, other than choosing a museum director to head the region and headquartered in San Francisco, they found regional directors in art collectors in Atlanta and Chicago, an architect in Colorado, an art teacher in Texas and Oklahoma who wasn't even from there. He was just on temporary assignment, an archaeologist in New Mexico and Arizona, a theater manager in Southern California, and an arts advocate in Washington State and Oregon. And many of the state leaders and lower down committee leaders were from even less of an art or museum background than that. The PWAP was announced to the national press on December 11th. Articles appeared nationwide in newspapers the next day. In Chicago, word had already leaked out, and artists were lined up before the official announcement. Despite the uneven density of artists and arts professionals, the PWA started up amazingly swiftly and efficiently, all things considered. Within days, the regional organizations were in place and gathering more volunteers. By December 16th, just 8 days after that initial meeting, the first 86 artists were at work and received their first checks. Naturally, some of the less populous areas lagged behind the East Coast centers, but it really is amazing how quickly the whole program moved forward, especially when you consider how such a thing might work today. They were passionate about getting it moving. Artists embraced the PWAP wholeheartedly in many cases, despite the fact that they were not used to applying to the federal government for work and had a few things to learn about. Woodstock, New York artist Harry Gottlieb, whose painting is shown here, wrote to Edward Bruce, "It is as if for many of us an invitation to project ourselves through our work into the highly exciting and stimulating world has broken the walls of our isolation. We are accepting this opportunity as a challenge, and if I'm not mistaken, a most important period of American art is in the making. Every artist I've spoken to and whose project I'm aware of is so keyed up to the importance of the situation that he is, without exception, putting every ounce of his energy and creative ability into his work as never before. It is with amazement that I see the electric charge that has come over the artist here." The organization details varied from place to place according to the individual regional and state directors, but all artists were urged to depict the American scene. And as you can see here, that could be urban or it could be very rural American countryside. That is, they were expected to show American subjects rather than foreign ones, and to show America usually as it currently was rather than scenes from the past. There were certainly historical scenes and historical portraits included, but there were many more subjects of America as it looked in the 1930s. To be included in the PWAP, each artist had to apply to the appropriate regional or state headquarters, filling in forms or writing letters detailing their training and history. They also had to reveal their financial circumstances. Sometimes this happened by forms, sometimes letters, sometimes both. And of course, it's wonderful when you can find those. For example, New York artist Saul Berman, who painted this painting here, of the New York waterfront, wrote to the Region 2 Administrator Juliana Force, director of the Whitney, on December 21st, 1933, so very soon after the announcement. "I'm sure you're well acquainted with my work and my ability as an artist, but perhaps you're not aware of my financial difficulties and the inability to get on in these trying times. I shall greatly appreciate it if you do all you can to find some work for me on some art project." Artists also had to devise and describe the projects they wanted to do in many cases. There were also sometimes assignments given to them. And then artists had to report back about their progress. Of course, the records of all of this can be incredibly useful and fascinating when we're researching individual artists or areas, groups. There are all kinds of different questions you can ask. Administrators were told they could hire any artists who were unemployed, but they were also told to fund only truly professional artists rather than art students or amateurs. And they were urged to concentrate on hiring the best artist. You can start to see how this could be a bit of a problem. Many regions were deluged with applications, many of them from students and hobbyist painters. So you had to sort these out. And of course, selecting the most deserving artists relied upon very personal judgments, and this worried a lot of people. There were protests from conservative organizations who assumed that people like Juliana Force would favor modernists. There were fears that certain art movements and organizations would be over or underrepresented. Personal opinions, such as whether women could be considered important professional artists, and certainly racism could come in there as well. These were guiding decisions because they're being made by individuals, and they caused a variety of different situations for artists in different regions and states according to who administered their area. There was no formal information about the races of the artists gathered except for the so-called Indian division in the native tribal-based projects undertaken in New Mexico. And after artists were recruited, there was some attempt to figure out who the African American artists were and to get some idea of the numbers of different kinds of people who were coming in, but it wasn't done formally. There was a lot of just conjecture and supposition. More recent researchers have been able to identify people a lot better, of course, looking into them. And so, for instance, Aaron Douglas, who painted murals, including this one for the Schomburg Center, there definitely were some wonderful African Americans, as we'll hear about later. And it would certainly be interesting to continue looking at the representation or lack of representation of various races, ethnicities, and kinds of people. Um, Women represented only about 1/4 to 1/5 of PWAP artists, depending upon region. And this reflects the fact that only one person per family was allowed to be on any form of government relief. That one person reflecting the values of the time was most likely to be a male worker in the household if there was one. Women on the project were often older people on average than the men and did not have children to care for at home by that time, perhaps. Victoria Cummings cites this in a fascinating article about women PWAP artists in East Texas. If we're lucky, all these fascinating records about PWAP artists and administrators survive, but where? The central records, including some of the reports about the progress of the program, communications with regional directors, etc., are at the National Archives and were microfilmed and are available through the Archives of American Art. Thank goodness the official report on the program that outlines its history and lists all the administrators and all the artists, although you do have to watch for typos, is available without paywall through the Hathi Trust, and there is a link on the Living New Deal website. Much of the real gold is in the applications, reports, and correspondence between regional and state administrators and the artists. You can see a couple of examples of that here. A letter and a form between Charles Walther and the Maryland administrators. Some of that material is available through the Archives of American Art, interviews with some of the regional directors and state directors, and with a lot of the artists are at the Archives of American Art, and papers from a few regions, including New York and Washington, D.C., which was administered by Duncan Phillips, director of the Phillips Collection, are also available there. And of course, many of the papers from the more important artists are also at the Archives of American Art. The majority of records concerning the individual artists and administrators involved with the PWAP are scattered around the country. Often they're in the papers of original administrators, but there's no rule as to whether those papers will be of the regional, state, or lower down administrators. For instance, the papers of John Ankeny, the director of the Dallas Museum of Fine Arts from 1929 to 1935, who administered PWAP's Region 12, are at the museum he directed. And information about Maryland PWAP artists like Herman Merrill is in the archives of the Baltimore.
From 904 552 6082.
Hush. Pardon me. I thought I turned them off.
904 552 6082 for it.
Thought I turned everything off. But in any case, okay. And information about Maryland artists is in the archives of the Baltimore Museum of Art because of Maryland's part of the PWAP was administered by the then director of the museum, Roland McKinney. And of course, there's also a great deal to be learned from newspaper accounts of the PWAP and its art. And a lot of that material, of course, now is available online in various ways. Sometimes behind paywall, sometimes not. The brevity of the project put a lot of emphasis on swift work. Fortunately for the artists, additional funding was provided to extend the program beyond the original cutoff date in February, but there were severe cuts to payrolls and pay rates. And that's often reflected in the papers and letters. The records of the administration, there are a lot of things listing people who were cut off at various dates and the changes in what they were paid. And it's amazing how much was completed, or at least well started, in so short a time. The approximately 3,700 PWAP artists produced over 15,600 works, murals, paintings, prints, drawings, sculpture, theatrical designs, museum dioramas, craft works. There were designs for paintings to be put in the National Zoo, all kinds of things. For large projects like murals, further funding was often found from other programs to allow the artist to complete the works. Wait a minute. gone too far. One of the most important documents is the catalog of the major exhibition of over 500 works held at the Corcoran Gallery of Art in Washington in April to May 34. Fortunately, the catalog is available via Google Books. And the Corcoran exhibition was vital for impressing federal officials. And many works were placed in federal offices. Once you'd gotten them to Washington, they were where they could be seen and have an impact. Some of these works were shown in the White House, and here is a list of the initial group. There were more added later on, but you can just imagine that when local hometown papers found out that their artists were shown in the White House, that would show up in newspapers, and so it did. And then there were a lot of works that went to ornament the new offices of the Department of Labor, headed by Francis Perkins. And other works were handed out to members of Congress and other high officials. All of this helped to publicize the program and keep it in the eyes of the officials and the public. Other works from the Corcoran exhibition toured the country to help bolster public and government awareness and support government arts programs. There's a lot of information about that in the central records, but there's probably also a great deal out there in the museums that they visited. And the lasting national influence of the PWAP is reflected in a number of articles that were done at the time in national magazines, really trying to get the word out. And as we know, this was successful. These efforts to support artists during the New Deal succeeded to an amazing degree. And so now I can hand it off to John Bolts to talk about Sargent Johnson, one of those artists who was part of this program. Thank you very much.
All right, great. Thank you very much, Anne. And I'd like to thank Mary Okin for the invitation to participate in this evening's webinar. And thanks to all of you for attending this evening. I'm looking forward to the Q&A at the end, and enjoyed Anne's presentation. And I'm looking forward to Jennifer's as well. So let's see, let me get my PowerPoint started here for you. All right, so this evening I'm going to focus on Sargent Johnson's project for the PWAP. And I'd like to just mention that the research I'm sharing this evening, some of it was conducted in collaboration with Dennis Carr and Jackie Francis, with whom I had the real pleasure of co-curating the exhibition Sargent Claude Johnson for the Huntington. The exhibition was open from February through May. I hope some of you got to go and see it. And if you have questions, based on your experience there, I'd love to answer them later. But I wanted to credit them for the collaborative component of the work. I really enjoyed the collaboration. I have an installation photo I want to start with, because I want to make the point that part of our project, organizing this exhibition, one thing that was really exciting about it was the opportunity to reunite almost all of Sargent Johnson's PWAP projects in one gallery for the first time in 40 years. Johnson created this project, which included several components I'll walk you through in a moment, in two phases, in 1933 to 1934 on the PWAP, and then he finished it in 1937 with funding from the Federal Art Project, which was part of the WPA, a subsequent federal program for funding public art, subsequent to the PWAP, its successor. And so the project was originally created for the California School for the Blind, a state-run school in Berkeley, California, and the decorations were for the auditorium at the school. And when the school was moved to a new campus in Fremont, also in the Bay Area, the University of California, Berkeley, which was adjacent to the School for the Blind, took over control of the campus. And unfortunately, while UC Berkeley was renovating the auditorium, turning it into what's now faculty housing, new faculty housing, they removed all the pieces of Johnson's project. None of them are still in the original building. They've all been dispersed. So there's one piece that remains at UC Berkeley, and the other parts have been dispersed to. They are now at the Huntington Museum, where you see the organ screen. That's the large artwork in three components you see on the screen here. They're at the California School for the Blind and on its new campus in Fremont. I'll show you some examples of that. And also, most recently, some of the last pieces have been donated to the African American History Museum that's part of the Oakland Public Library in Oakland, California. So the best news is that all the parts of Sargent Johnson's project, having been lost and dispersed, are once again in public collections. They're no longer in the same place. They're no longer in the original building, but they are all being maintained they're publicly accessible. Um, and so that's what allowed us to bring all but a couple of the lunettes, the window lunettes that I'll show you, back together again at the Huntington this spring. So the Johnson's project this was his first public art project, as it was for many of the artists on the PWAP. Right, that's one of the great opportunities it created, and the main part of his original project is what you see on the screen here, this organ screen that he carved from redwood and then painted in some parts. Some parts it's unpainted, right? The parts that look brown on the screen to you here, they're unpainted. The parts that look gold have been painted red first with what Johnson referred to as a red bowl, and then gilt, partly gilt. So in some places the red paint he allowed it to show, and then in many parts he detailed the highlights with gilding. The kind of tan parts of the organ screen that you see here were originally fabric, excuse me, because the organ screen, oops, hold on, there we go. The organ screen, when mounted in the auditorium, concealed the organ, which is in the loft you'd access from that little staircase you see in the doorway with the rounded top, leads up to the organ loft in the original building. And so the organ is concealed from the audience behind this organ screen, which serves the purpose of keeping the organ clean, but also adds a decorative element. The design is of children and wild animals and plants, seemingly enjoying nature in this bucolic setting. Much of the work created under the PWAP focused on the American scene, American landscape, American workers. Sargent Johnson's project is different because he chose to take on an allegorical theme, right? Rather than represent an actual place or real people, as most of the PWAP artists chose to do. He chose a theme that's related to music, the purpose for the auditorium. At the School for the Blind, music was a core part of the curriculum. And so picking an allegorical theme that could relate to what the students were learning, what the teachers were teaching them, for a building in which the students performed music regularly, seems like a completely appropriate subject matter. Along the 6 windows, there were 6 windows, 3 on each side of the auditorium, and at the tops, the rounded tops of the windows, Johnson created for those window lunettes, made from the same materials, made the same way, carved from redwood, possibly mahogany, with some red bowl beneath the gilding, and then gilt. And I find it interesting that Johnson pierced so many circular holes in these window lunettes. They're decorative, of course, and they add to help highlight and emphasize some of the details of the lunettes. But it's also possible that Johnson's thinking about the students at the school whose blindness, as the school referred to it at the time, um, ranged, had covered a full range of partial sightedness. And so some of the students were able to see light, some of the students were able to see forms. And so it's possible, I think, that Johnson knowing that, pierced these holes in the window lunettes to create a kind of visual effect that perhaps is meant to play in sympathy or allegorically to represent the kind of visual form of music, your music in visual form. That's purely speculation on my part, but I like to think that he's thinking about his audience when he makes these low relief carvings. For the other end, in 1937, on the federal art program, he created a proscenium, which is the panel that goes above the stage. You see it here atop the curtains in the auditorium at the School for the Blind. And that piece is still University of California, Berkeley, and takes on themes ranging from, music and theater both, incorporates several masks into the design. This piece is solid. It's not pierced because sound is not supposed to travel through it, right? So it differs from the organ screen in that respect. Okay. And in terms of researching Sargent Johnson's project, there are several places we've gone for information. One is to the photographs that exist, and there are a handful of photographs kept as part of the PWAP and as part of the WPA that document the project in situ, like the photographs I've shown you, or this wonderful one of the part of the proscenium in Johnson's backyard where he kept a studio in process, right before he's applied the bowl or the gilding. Simply just showing you the carving of one detail of the proscenium. Oh, sorry, it is part of the organ screen. And I just, oh no, it is the proscenium, right? And I just wanted to point out a detail. So all the scenes are bucolic and idealizing in these carvings, except for one detail, right? Over on this side, on the far right end of the proscenium, there's a wolf appearing on the scene, which I think is a really interesting addition. And I'm still working on what this means. What its significance in the scene is, but it seems to, of course, adds a touch of perhaps of realism allegorically again, like as the rest of the work is. Right? I've been thinking about it in terms of like Prokofiev's Peter and the Wolf, created in between the two parts of this project that Sargent Johnson created, right? Where he's thinking originally, he works with a collaborator who writes a libretto for Prokofiev to set to music that's very didactic about the Soviet equivalent of a Boy Scout, at the time, and helping somebody out. And Prokofiev rejects that and writes something much more poetic and, of course, allegorical about a young boy saving the animals and saving himself and his family from a threatening wolf, right? So I think that's a possible inspiration, but I'm still working on that. So where else do we go for research? To the places that have these works. The California School for the Blind has this panel of Louis Braille. I haven't found any documentation of this specific piece funded by the WPA yet. That's part of why we have a circa date on it. And this is kept today in the library at the School for the Blind. It would have been topical for Johnson to create this panel because Braille's some American institutions for the blind have begun adopting Braille's method of writing for people who are blind, and so and the School for the Blind had adopted Braille's system earlier in the decade. So it's a system, that would have meaning to the faculty and students at the school, right? And it shows Louis Braille at a table, this modernist angular flattening of the table around which several students are gathered while he teaches them. And one of the wonderful discoveries here is when it came off the wall of the school to be sent to the Huntington, it was discovered that there was like a rough draft, a first effort on the back of the panel. You can see it partially completed here, upside down from the finished version of the panel. One other element of learning by going to places like the School for the Blind, so when Dennis and I visited there in early 2023, we learned that the first librarian, when the school moved, this had gone over a doorway, presumably. We don't know exactly where it was originally in the building. But at the new library, it was placed much lower, and the librarian encouraged students to explore it by touch, to experience it by feeling it, which inspired us for our exhibition to have the Huntington commissioned replica, a touchable plastic replica to be made that looks exactly like the original. Which was mounted in the exhibition beneath the original carving of Johnson's, with a sign inviting visitors to touch it, to experience it by touch. And it, along with some of the other artworks, had a text panel with translated into Braille, explaining the history of this piece and the larger within the larger project of Johnson's, encouraging people to explore it as for a couple of decades students at the School for the Blind have. With the show having closed, the museum is donating the replica to the School for the Blind. So both the original and the replica have gone back to the school so that students can experience the work again by both sight and touch. Another place we go for research is the archives. And as Ann just mentioned, the Archives of American Art is a wonderful resource. I wanted to bring in this photograph I'd taken while I was at the Huntington, which has a set of the Archives of American Art's microfilm. This is the real NDA New Deal Art 3, on which I found Walter Heil's papers, some of Walter Heil's papers. Walter Heil was the director for Northern California and several other Western states for the PWAP. And indeed, his papers include some of the documentation for Northern California PWAP projects. And so going through this, I was able to find various information. This is the very first page on the very first notebook he seems to have kept once he began his role as the Northern California administrator for the PWAP. And it's just a list of artists. I would imagine it's, maybe he's brainstorming or he's in a conversation with others. What names let's throw out some names and think about artists who we might want to consider for projects. And I think this is important because for Sargent Johnson, is one of the few Black artists hired on the PWAP. It's a project that hired artists, as Ann mentioned, on the basis of quality, right? The FAP, the Federal Art Project of the WPA, subsequently required that artists, need the financial demonstrate need first before, being considered for hiring. But with the PWAP, the basis for hiring was supposed to be the artist's qualifications and ability. First and foremost, in fact, perhaps those were the only qualifications to be considered. And there's Sargent Johnson, number 2 on the list, the second artist they come up with. This is a multiple page list, right, with all these other Bay Area artists on the list. And for me, that says something about his standing, right? So this documentation helps us understand not only his involvement in the PWAP, but what it meant in terms of his recognition as an important artist in the Bay Area. He's known by this time nationally as an important New Negro artist, part of the New Negro Renaissance. But in the Bay Area, he's already known as an important modernist, right? Not simply as a Black artist. He's recognized by the mid-30s as one of the most important sculptors in California. Recognized in the Bay Area and in Southern California and parts of Southern California too, like the San Diego Museum of Art, the first museum to acquire his work, right? So I find these documents really interesting, right? There's documents of his having been paid, the rate he's being paid, along with the pay of other artists, documentation, record of sketches and paintings that the artist had to submit, And he's listed here in the middle of the page, it's an alphabetical list, as having submitted 2 drawings for the project of the School for the Blind. I don't know where the drawings are. I hope they show up someday. I hope to find them. But here's a record that he made them and he turned them in, right, to the PWAP administrators. And then finally, this really great document from a mimeographed report. This is a description from the Archives of American Art, a mimeographed report of artists, their work, costs, etc., created at the end of the project by Region 15, the Northern California and several other Western states project of the PWAP, documenting exactly how much Johnson was paid, right? $681.20 for 17 weeks of work. He's hired as a master artist, right, the highest level of standing of employment on the PWAP. And he has standing not only to get this commission, to be the sole artist on this commission for the School for the Blind, but he's also authorized to hire an assistant. And so it shows that he hired George E. Watkins of Oakland as an assistant. I'm still researching who Watkins was. I think he's another Black artist in the Bay Area, one of several Black artists that Johnson mentored and taught in the 1930s and 40s and subsequently in the Bay Area. It shows, how much they were paid in total, and then notes that the School for the Blind donated the redwood, donated the redwood to the project. So they bought the redwood that Johnson used to carve the organ screen and the lunettes for the auditorium. So these records are fantastic. I'm hoping to find more information in some other archival sources that I'm trying to get a hold of. More to come, to be announced. Watch this space. But I think I've run out of time, so I better stop there, and I will turn things over to Jennifer.
Thank you, John. Let me share my screen. Thank you both, John and Ann, as well as Mary, for the invitation. This has been so much fun and so educational. Thank you. Can you hear me? I hope my sound is working correctly. Thank you. Oops. All right, there we go. I'm speaking today about Belle Baranceanu. She has an unusual last name spelling there because she is the daughter of Romanian immigrants, and Baranceanu was an up-and-coming artist in both Minneapolis and Chicago before the Depression hit. And when she came to San Diego in 1933, she was a Dust Bowl refugee, totally destitute, and a single unemployed woman. And that actually ended up being the making of her career in terms of becoming not only an artist for the PWAP, but an artist who worked for every other government relief art project in the United States at the time during the New Deal era. This is a picture of her, a photograph of her on the right. She's painting a mural here much later on in the 40s for the Federal Art Project. And muralism was something she was interested in Chicago. And starting with the PWAP, she was able to become not only a muralist, but dabbled in not only oil painting, but also illustrating school books and doing a myriad of different types of art, which she probably would not have had a chance to do had it not been for the New Deal art projects in the 1930s and 40s.
Jennifer,
Really quickly, she was born in Chicago in 1902. She moved around quite a bit. She was taken at a relatively young age from Chicago to North Dakota, where she grew up. And her mother and father ended up getting divorced, and her mother moved her to Minneapolis so that she could attend the Minneapolis School of Art starting in 1921. When she was there, she met Anthony Angarola, who was not only her teacher and mentor, but he later became her boyfriend, and it's possible that he was also her fiance, although we don't have any definitive record on that.
Jennifer,
In any case,
Uh,
she
your screen. I just wanted to,
I'm sorry.
yeah, just sorry to interrupt you.
Sorry, I thought it was sharing. Sorry. Let me pull this up. Thank you. There we go. Thanks. Now it's working. There we go. There we go. So here we go. So she ended up moving onto the Art Institute of Chicago because she followed Anthony Angarola. In 1927, she decided she needed a break, and they ended up having a long distance relationship between 1927 and 1929. And she moved to Los Angeles, and she really blossomed as an artist there in the 20s, between 1927 and 29 in LA. This picture on the right is one of her more famous pictures. It's called Riverview Section Chicago. And we have this on exhibit now at the San Diego exhibition that Mary discussed earlier. In any case, this one was really neat because when she was attending the Art Institute of Chicago in 1926, she decided to enter this as her entry for a very prestigious exhibition that was an annual occurrence at the Art Institute of Chicago. And most students didn't make it in on their first try, but Baranceanu did, and her career just sort of took off from there. Between 1926 and 1928, she exhibited a lot at both the Art Institute of Chicago exhibitions, as well as out here in Southern California, in Los Angeles. Let me move on to the next slide. Here's a couple of other paintings. This one on the left is called The Yellow Robe, and it's at the San Diego Museum of Art. This is a portrait of her sister, Teresa. And this on the right is a portrait of her grandmother that she painted in Los Angeles. And what's interesting here is that she was dabbling in the 20s between landscape painting, painting working class people in her neighborhood in the 20s and 30s, as well as painting her family members. And she's really developing a modernist style here in the 1920s during her Los Angeles period. Okay, here's another example of one of her landscapes. This is called Elysian Park or Elysian Hills. And she entered this in one of the exhibitions through the Art Institute of Chicago in 1928. This particular painting, along with another one called Lee, sold for $900 each. And so I just think it's really interesting that as a young up-and-coming artist in her very first shows, she was making $1,800 a month, which 10 years later was more income than she was making 10 years later. So she was making about $1,200 annually a year, 12 months or 10 years later. So she's really influenced by Cezanne. She's influenced by Van Gogh, amongst other artists, and you can kind of see that here. So in 1933, Baranceanu relocated from Los Angeles back to Chicago in 1929, and she stayed there from 1929 until 1932. And in the fall of 1932, she decided to move back to California. And so when she came out here, she was like a lot of other refugees from the Midwest who had experienced a lot of unemployment and destitution. While she was in Chicago, she was part-time employed at Hull House, and she also taught art classes at a number of neighborhood art schools. She just wasn't hired full-time, and she didn't have enough money to keep her going, nor was her family in a position where they had enough income at the time. So in 1933, her luck kind of started to change because she was classified under the relief status as not only a single woman who had no income that needed relief, but she was also classified as a Class A artist, which meant that in the PWAP, as Ann already mentioned, she was making roughly about $25 a week or more, a little bit more than that. So she was paid in California wages as a skilled laborer. And so on the right here, you can see this, sorry, it's a little bit blurry, but this is a really old piece of burlap. And this was an example of how they had to show what they were going to do in terms of their mural project before it actually was approved and allowed to go forward. So Baranceanu painted this picture of San Diego. She was given the theme to paint the industries in San Diego. So she included the military down here, agriculture, the landscape of San Diego, and even included some oil wells, which are actually not indigenous at all to San Diego. That's more like Los Angeles. So that, I think she was just kind of looking at what can I remember about different areas and different, fields of industry. But anyway, this is, when you see it in person, it's even more remarkable. It looks horrible. It's got like craft paint. It's the cheapest looking burlap. It's not even canvas. And I think this goes to show, the ingenuity of the PWAP in that they were very conscious of not wasting money on anything. So in terms of making a mock-up, a sketch that could be signed off, they gave her the worst paint possible. They gave her the worst canvas possible, and they said, have at it. And so she painted this, which had been gessoed over at least 3 times. It's very thick. So that meant that 3 other artists had already used this piece of canvas before Belle got a chance to get to it. So in any case, Belle was hired and she completed in 1934 her mural San Diego, and I'll show you what it looks like over here. As you can see, a much nicer representation compared to that very rough mock-up that I just showed you. Baranceanu also painted another mural that was destroyed called Brothers of the Church, which featured Padres and a little bit of San Diego history. She's really honing in this image here to all of the things that she found remarkable to San Diego. And I think Baranceanu is kind of a good example of the ingenuity of the PWAP as well, because she was a person who was brand new to San Diego in 1933 and had been to California briefly, but was very enthralled with California in terms of the difference of scenery and difference of industries when you compare it with the Midwest or Chicago. So as I mentioned already, she was one of a small handful of artists to work for all of the federal government fine art relief projects. And the PWAP in San Diego was overseen, it was Region 14, and it was overseen by a number of people locally. Merrill Armitage was one of them. Reginald Poland was another, and Bernard Rufberg was a third one. And so these were, Reginald Poland was actually from the San Diego Museum of Art, and he was put in charge of like vetting the artists. And so Belle arrived with a reputation from Chicago, but it was a very limited reputation. She was brand new to the art world, and they took a chance on her and let her paint what she wanted to do within reason. And so she's a really interesting artist in that regard, in that she was able to accomplish quite a bit in a very short amount of time. So in terms of Region 14 artists, there were 14 artists that produced art across Southern California. 2 mural projects, for example. So Belle was one of those. 196 oil paintings, 24 prints, 24 sketches, 31 sculptures, 280 watercolors, and that's all within a roughly 5-month period of time, which is quite amazing when you think about it. In terms of San Diego, the hiring was quite small. There weren't that many artists to begin with. Los Angeles was a bigger art center, as was San Francisco. San Diego is often forgotten, but a lot of artists that came out to San Diego during the 30s were on their way to other places. Particularly, a lot of them were wanting to go to Mexico to see what Diego Rivera was up to. And in any case, Belle was one of 15 women hired in San Diego, but they also had 47 men hired on the PWAP. So out of those 15 women, she ended up becoming again, employed with a sister project, which was called the San Diego City Schools Curriculum Project, which continued from it was funded, it was funded initially through PWAP, and then it ran all the way until 1930, and from 1933 till 1943. So there's a lot of sources and challenges with studying the New Deal art. Exhibitions are a good place to start, I think, always, and that's how I first learned about Baranceanu. I had run into her art before locally in San Diego, but it was misclassified as WPA, and nobody could tell me who she was or what agency she worked for. The biggest source for me has been Belle Baranceanu's personal papers, which are housed at the San Diego History Center. In addition to that, the Smithsonian's Archives of American Art that the other two presenters have already talked about was a great place to go as well. I utilized a lot of letters and the Holter Cahill papers at the Smithsonian as well as Belle's papers. And in terms of government records, I would just also recommend that people look at the National Archive Record Group sets. For California, that's number 60, and it's different for every other state. But you can trace a lot of the funding and the projects and who was the project itself and the funding back through those WPA record cards. In terms of the PWAP, you need to go to the State Emergency Relief Administration papers. And that's a great starting point as well for a lot of this art. So in any case, Baranceanu, I think, is just a great example of an artist that was not well known. Her career was made by the PWAP and other federal art projects or in the New Deal era. And I think that there's probably across the country a lot of like underrated or underknown artists that are slowly but surely being discovered or rediscovered, as the case may be. So Belle went on to work for the Federal Art Project. She also worked for the Treasury Relief Art Project and painted a post office mural. That one came about a little bit later, which is why we're not discussing it tonight. And of course, I would also recommend, if anyone wants more information, to reach out to me. I'd be happy to answer your questions, or through the Living New Deal, that would be a good place to reach me. Or perhaps maybe even consult my book if you're interested in learning more about Baranceanu and her life. Thank you very much. Let's get out of that. Sorry, Mary, trying to.
Well,
I'm trying to unshare. There we go.
There we go. Well, first of all, thank you so much, everyone, for joining us, and also for all our speakers for your fascinating talks and insights into PWAP specific research and larger kind of questions about the New Deal and where we go from here in the 21st century, and thinking about these artists, the programs, etc. We've had a number of questions in the chat. I think one thing I'd love to hear from each of you, and I should let our audience know that if you'd like to stick around for Q&A, we can stay on for a little bit to do that. I'm curious to know, where are the PWAP artworks now? I think that was a question that somebody asked in the chat. And John, you've taken us through the complexities of one project being disassembled and ending up in all kinds of places. But do you, the rest of you have, or John, do you want to say more? And Jennifer, do you have thoughts about the locations of PWAP projects?
Well, I can start with a little bit of some of the generalities and say that the Living New Deal has a lot of wonderful listings about where things are. The official agency that keeps track of all of this is the U.S. General Services Administration, which has a page called Where's the Art? And they are trying to keep track of where a lot of things are, but I think there's a vast amount that is scattered all around. Originally, everything started out in public buildings, and of course, public buildings across the country. So they are incredibly scattered. Of the ones that came to Washington, a very high percentage are now at the Smithsonian American Art Museum, and they have a lot of other things that were not in that original Corcoran show, but an awful lot of those are at the Smithsonian. And a lot of things are still on the walls where they were designed to be, although, as John found out, not necessarily.
Right, that's very true. I mean, my understanding is it's all supposed to be property of the federal government still. Like it's not supposed to be dispersed or sold or given away or taken by anybody. Um, but as Johnson's project at the School for the Blind shows, when a building changes hands, uh, if nobody's paying attention to the material, it's easy for it to walk away or to be lost. Like the story for some of the window lunettes that were saved from the School for the Blind when Berkeley was renovating that building is that they were basically saved from being thrown out. And the organ screen was, for some reason, Berkeley sold it as like surplus furniture, like an old filing cabinet or something for a little more than $100 to, to
One of the
some lucky
problems,
person who found it.
yeah, one of the problems was that
Yeah.
no money was set aside for the care for things. They were just made and deposited with wherever they were going to be. And there was no money to have a program to tell people how to care for them or to do any care or to let people know that they really shouldn't walk off with them. So
And I
many,
did, in Walter Howe's papers, I did find evidence that artworks were given to museums where museums were invited to choose artworks for their collections. Of course, some were sent to Washington, as you mentioned, Anne, and then some were, there's a statement in Howe's papers that any that were not claimed by an institution that like a museum didn't want or that weren't created for a specific place were being given to the San Francisco city schools for educational use for them to do what they wanted with for art teaching. So who knows how many artworks ended up in various school classrooms in San Francisco and what happened to those over the years.
that's fascinating. I didn't know that. I was surprised. Now I can't remember the name of the artist, but I was surprised when I had first moved to Arkansas to see what was clearly, and I looked it up and verified that it was a PWAP work that was on view at the Central Arkansas Public Library in Little Rock, and it had indeed originally been made for that institution when it was in a very different building in a very different state and had remained in it. And they still have it all these decades later. So there's certainly instances like that where there's probably uh, a more complicated history than it looks like, but some of them are indeed still there, but you sure can't assume it.
Jennifer, did you have any Belle works that maybe not for the PWAP, but the New Deal more broadly that walk away or are lost and we were searching for? I think this is maybe an even bigger question about New Deal art in general. And I should, before I let you answer, Jennifer, I should say that one of the webinars I hope our art initiative can host later this year, early next, will be with the GSA, the Government Services Administration, and you can hear and learn a little bit more about what they do and don't do in terms of managing New Deal art heritage nationally.
Well, to answer your question, in terms of the PWAP, her San Diego mural is still in the federal bankruptcy courthouse in San Diego. So that's nice. It's been protected. And I would just say that the rest of her art, thank goodness, has been saved by the San Diego History Center. That was through the work of Belle's best friend, Lee Wallace, who made sure that her paintings were donated to the San Diego History Center. So they're now the custodians of keeping track of her paintings and, putting them on view. Other than that, there's definitely been a lot of interest in her art amongst collectors. Probably the biggest collection is through Doctors Brahm and Sandy Dykstra. Their Dykstra collection has a number of Belle's works, and I know that they recently have had some now been accepted at the Whitney Museum. And so maybe in the future, other museums in other parts of the country will get a chance to have some of Belle's work in their museums as well. But I think just in my case, I was very fortunate to have such great access to her art and
Now in
to see it
Jonesboro,
up close and
90 degrees
personal.
Fahrenheit with clear skies and sun. Tonight's forecast has some clouds with a chance of thunder showers, with a low of 74 degrees. Also, there's a heat advisory in effect until Tuesday, July 6th.
So one of the questions that we had in the chat, if I can pivot us a little bit, asks about public art today, and is there any such movement? The PWAP is this kind of watershed moment for public art in the United States, and the New Deal programs that grew out of it, this kind of proof of concept, 5-month, super prolific experiment ended up producing an incredible amount of work and making the federal government the largest patron of art in the world in the 1930s. What are your thoughts on public art today? I'll share briefly that I learned from talking with members of the GSA that the federal government actually does commission art still, which isn't as well known, that federal buildings have a portion, new federal buildings have a portion of their budget that actually goes to supporting public art for those buildings. But what are your thoughts, if you have any? Always tricky to ask historians to comment on the present and future, but what are your thoughts on public art and as in American life today?
Of course, politics play a strong role in this, considering the history of various shows that have been canceled and people have protested and so on. By and large, other than what you're talking about, I think everything tends to go through museums. It tends to be that the museums or other agencies are going for funding from the federal government, and they make the decisions rather than the government making it. So that helps the government to avoid being attacked from any point of view on the decisions about what art they are supporting. Which I would imagine that was a bit of a problem in the 1930s, but I think it's a far more severe one now.
I should say that during COVID, there was also this moment of public support for the arts, where people were home during, and the arts were really hard hit by the pandemic, whether that was the visual or the performing arts. And there was a kind of outpouring of federal support. It'll be interesting. I'm not an expert in that at all, but I know that was another moment of public funding, and there have been some others. Some of the webinars I'm hoping to be able to announce in the fall have to do with CETA, another era of federal sponsorship of the arts in the 70s that people forget happened, and has a really interesting through line going from the New Deal, from the PWAP and the other New Deal programs, into what was happening for public art in the 70s. And we can see that, during COVID and in the kind of little known federal art sponsored or federally sponsored public art projects and buildings today.
And I know that there are a lot of the larger public sponsors outside the government who really kicked up their levels of support, and in some cases started new areas or changed what they were supporting in response to COVID. So there certainly have been a lot of artists who have benefited from those funders as well. Like I know the Wingate Foundation in Arkansas did that. So I don't know how many others, but there have certainly been a lot of major funders who have changed their guidelines and opened things up into new areas.
So I have another question for each of you, since you're scholars as well as curators. What have you learned from, putting together exhibitions in terms of talking to the public and the public response to these works?
Well, when I was touring around doing some talks on the 1934 New Deal for Artists show, I was bowled over by the response. This was starting up in 2009, when we'd been having such severe financial problems in the country, and but going on as it toured. Sometimes so many people would turn out for a gallery talk that we could hardly move around the galleries. And these are not necessarily in very large places. That was particularly the case in Davenport, Iowa. It was amazing response, absolutely amazing. I was just bowled over by all the interest and support. They were wonderful.
Yeah, I can share from the experience of the Sargent Johnson exhibition at the Huntington this spring that from what I saw and heard, people were thrilled to learn about his work. People who didn't know his work already, and really pleased to get to see some, like a project like the School for the Blind project, almost entirely reunited. The only reason we couldn't get all the parts of it into the show was that we only learned about a couple of them late, just like a month or two before the show opened, and there wasn't space to add them. But it's we heard stories, I remember at one event, somebody came up to me and told me that he'd been a Boy Scout in the 60s in Berkeley, and that his troop had occasionally done activities with students from the School for the Blind, and that one time they were gathering at the School for the Blind, their scout leader, brought the boys into the auditorium and to admire Sargent Johnson's work, like pointed it out, said this is a really important artwork by an artist named Sargent Johnson, and it's right here in Berkeley. To hear about the importance that this work has for a community, decades after its creation, and that people remember it decades after it's, no longer there, I think speaks to the importance of this work. And my sense is that audiences today are really excited to learn about it and to have the opportunity to see it. It's fun to share it. It's a lot of fun. It's really rewarding to get to share this work with people.
I would say the most interesting comments I think I've heard it has been about Belle's destroyed art. She has one mural at the La Jolla post office that is currently a little bit water damaged, and a few years ago was severely under threat of being completely destroyed because they wouldn't sell the post office, and you can't remove the mural from the post office, for example. That and her 7 Arts mural, which I showed you the picture at the front of the presentation. The 7 Arts mural was torn down for seismic damage. The auditorium they thought couldn't handle an earthquake in the 70s, and it ended up taking them like over an hour just to knock it down. So horrible, just absolutely horrible. So people have always said that to me, that they're just like aghast that this stuff isn't protected and that people would want to destroy it. The other thing that's been really nice to see, piggybacking off of John's comments, is that I'm really excited to see younger people interested in the New Deal. There's a lot of kids don't realize what's around them. And so when you start showing them what's around them, they have a greater appreciation of their own sort of local history. And then they want to see what's going on in other parts of the country as well.
I should do a little plug for Living New Deal there. If you are game to yourself or recruit others to go off into your community and find New Deal projects or explore archives and identify New Deal projects, you are more than welcome to submit them to Living New Deal, and we will add them to our national map of New Deal sites, which include artworks and some of what we've been talking about tonight. There's one more question, and then we should probably wrap things up. One question in the chat asked about contact information for our speakers for further questions. If you'd like to get in touch with them, I don't know there's a way to post contact information, but if you email me, and my name is Mary Oken, you find me on the Living New Deal website, I'd be happy to connect you with our speakers. So I'll be the contact person for connecting you with. So the last question is, there've been, in addition, Jennifer, to your exhibition and John's exhibition, there have been a number of other exhibitions in recent years. So the Dykstra exhibition, also at the Huntington, an exhibition at the Met, the Baltimore Museum of Art, etc. So there seems to be this energy around the New Deal. What do you think about this? What can we learn from the renewed interest? And I would maybe add to that, what can we learn about public art, which is different than art created for the market? It has a different audience initially, and it has a different value maybe because it's owned by the American people as opposed to a commodity bought and sold in private hands, although it can certainly turn into that.
It is kind of an interesting question, because I think a lot of people consider that artists must have been heavily censored in what they could do for the government. I think in many cases it was more self-censorship. They were thinking about, especially for the PWAP, when people hadn't done this before, they weren't sure how it was going to work. And there are certainly comments from some of the administrators, like I have to look up and see whose quote from, I think it might be Edward Bruce, that they would have to be crazy to do a nude for the PWAP, and know that artists needed to have their heads up about things. But there were certainly abstract things done, and there were certainly some, it was not as much, but it's interesting about how they approached things. And there were, as you said, there were things that people could do that you couldn't do for somebody's living room. One of the artists in the 1934 New Deal for Artists show painted the breaker of a coal mine in New Mexico. How many living rooms would want that? But for the government, you could do that. There were certain things that artists really wanted to do that this gave them the opportunity.
Yeah, I know, just to build on what Ann was just saying, Sargent Johnson in his, the Archives of American Art, as part of its effort to document the New Deal art programs, did a number of oral histories. And there's no collection of Sargent Johnson's papers anywhere, which is really unfortunate. It's incredibly difficult to find archival documentation of his career, remarkably. But he did do one of their oral histories. And while, unfortunately, I think the interviewers were more interested in what he knew about some other artists than about his own career experience, which I think says a lot about the way in which the histories of Black artists as part of the New Deal have sometimes been, minimized, diminished, overlooked, until, recently that's changed a lot, but even into the 60s. And one thing he says in that oral history interview is that the public art programs were fantastic because they gave him the opportunity to make the art he wanted to make. They gave him incredible artistic freedom. They provided funds for the materials. They paid him to make they paid for his time. They gave him assistance to help him realize projects. And he did some incredible work for the Federal Art Project on the WPA after doing this first project for the PWAP, his first public project. So the Mary is lucky to have a few projects by him. And there's a question, one of the questions in the Q&A chat is about social and political themes in the PWAP. And there definitely were artists who addressed social themes and political themes in to varying degrees of overtness in their work. And one thing I'm looking at is the question of like why Johnson didn't more overtly address, questions of race, for example. I think he did deal with questions of sexuality in his project for Aquatic Park in San Francisco for the Aquatic Park Bathhouse. But it's an interesting. There are all kinds of interesting questions still to be asked and answered about these artists' work.
I thank you for bringing up the the social and political elements of the New Deal. There was a question, and I should just answer really quickly about the other New Deal programs like the Treasury section. So those followed the PWAP, and there were scandals of PWAP projects, particularly Coit Tower, that had a huge impact on how those programs were run, how commissions were awarded, and so on, where there were sort of crackdowns on, making sure artists did what they said they were going to do, and so on. But there was also a lot of creative freedom. So it's exciting to see. And you got just sort of a taste of what the PWAP was about, really a tiny, tiny taste of it tonight. Any final thoughts from our visitors? There've been some specific questions about John, your exhibition, and Jennifer as well. So I'll maybe email you those contact information separately, unless maybe that's something you want to mention again. And I also would like to say that there is information about our art initiative available on our website. I think links are being posted about that. And you can find copies of Ann's exhibition catalog, the 1934 PWAP show. You can find and purchase copies of Sargent Johnson catalog at the Huntington, and Jennifer's book about Belle. So if you have a further interest and want to deepen your understanding of what we've been talking about, and some of that material more extensively, please consider going to your library or purchasing those books. Any final thoughts? And thank you so much for being here today. And also thank you again to our donors for supporting this kind of programming.
Yeah, thank you.
I'll just share one quick thought. Oh, sorry. Go ahead,
Yeah,
Ann.
go ahead. I was just going to say thank you to everybody who's made it possible.
Yeah, that was basically what I wanted to say too. I wanted to thank you again, Mary, and thanks Jennifer and Ann for sharing all that really wonderful information, including sources, archival sources you found too. And I'm excited that the Living New Deal is supporting more research and more sharing of information among scholars and between scholars and the public. And I'm excited to see the webinars that are coming up. So thank you.
Absolutely. I'll be watching eagerly.
Thank you very much, Mary and John and Ann and the audience for all of your great questions and joining us today.
Yes, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your time, and I'm so grateful to our speakers. Thanks for helping me kick off the Art History Advocating for New Deal Art Initiative series. More from us on that soon. I hope you enjoyed this webinar, and it will be, the recording will be posted and available through YouTube. If you're interested in seeing it, we'll make an announcement on our website when it's available. So just look for that, or send me a note sometime probably next week, and I'll be able to share the link with you directly. Thank you, everyone. Have a wonderful evening and a wonderful week. Take care.
Good night.